Welcome to this Campfire session. I think it's our sixth or so in this ongoing series. Today we're going to be talking about designing and developing browser applications. So as you know, the development paradigm is changing more and more towards a web-centric development. Browser development is becoming more and more important. The kind of considerations you have to take into account when you're dealing with all these different flavors of browser, it's something that developers have to think about before they start developing a web application. So what are the differences between, what is the impact on your development, say, from whether you want to develop for IE 8 or not? What about Firefox, or what about Safari, and what about accessing your application through a phone or a tablet? So all of these considerations are something that the developers who over the years have gotten used to developing, say, primarily Windows-based application have to now contend with. So this session is just to point out some of those challenges, share some of our experiences, and hope you guys can share some of your experiences with us. The panelist here is going to be Oliver. Most of you know Oliver. He's our senior technologist at Mertech. And we also have Jessica, who's been working on some projects for us, Jessica Chan. She's based out of San Francisco, and she works on some projects with Mertech. So without further ado, I'm going to let Oliver take over. Oliver?
Thank you, Riaz. So to get started in this today, we basically have three main areas that we're going to look at that deal with this cross-browser issue, and that's the use of browser features, the various different things that are supported by way of elements in HTML and also JavaScript and CSS features. Excuse me, there's the way web pages actually render on different browsers, and then there's the way JavaScript executes on different browsers. So when you're dealing with cross-browser compatibility, those are basically the areas that really you have to deal with. Now all of this kind of goes back in time to when we started with browser technologies. Early on there were a couple of web browsers that used their own custom engines, and then very quickly as the internet grew, we broke out into basically 5 main rendering engines that are used by the various browsers, and this is really where the interpretation of the HTML and ECMA script, JavaScript standards kind of, it becomes interpreted really by the various rendering engines in slightly different ways. So to kind of break out the usage here, Safari and older versions of Chrome, actually up to current versions of Chrome, and very recently Opera are all using what's called the WebKit engine. This engine is also used on a mobile version of it is also used like on the iPad and iPhone. Next up we have Internet Explorer. Starting at version 4 we have the Trident engine. Now they actually made the Trident engine a separate engine so that you could embed web pages in your application, and so they broke it out from just being Internet Explorer and application to actually being this rendering engine that you had the use of. And still today, in fact, Internet Explorer 10 even uses this Trident engine, and a variation of it is used for like Windows 8 RT for the RT version there. Firefox has always had their own homemade sort of engine called Gecko that they developed long ago, and that's still being developed. And then Opera recently has switched to an engine they call Presto. There isn't too much on, Opera switched to WebKit. Before that, they used Presto. Opera isn't a high utilization browser, but it is one of the other main engines that people develop for. And then very recently, Google has announced that Chrome, starting with version 28, which I believe version 27 is the current release version. So the next version is going to use a rendering engine called Blink, which is actually a fork of the WebKit engine, where they're kind of making it their own. They're trying to simplify things for what they call a multi-process architecture. So these are the various engines that your website is going to be running against that you have to deal with. The the various sort of coding issues. Now, a lot of the coding issues that come up around cross-browser compatibility actually center on Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer is different than everything else. In recent versions of Internet Explorer, we've actually gotten to something that is much more similar to what the other browsers render and support from a functionality standpoint. But when you go to slightly older versions of Internet Explorer, things diverge quite a bit. And it's always been this way, and basically that's what a lot of this topic is based around. Secondly, in relation to these browser features, there are many things that maybe you haven't even heard of or not quite using yet that are just really very new in all of these web browsers that basically you have to decide how you're going to handle supporting these if you want to use some of these features. Local storage is basically the ability to have a either local file storage or database access that is kept in the browser that actually you have access to from JavaScript. So you can basically store data into what's called a SQLite database is what most of them use, using what's called the IndexedDB feature. And so most of the new browsers have support for this, but when you go to older browsers, you have to decide how you're going to deal with that if you need support there. WebSockets is an area related to actually being able to do bidirectional communication without having to use some of these AJAX-based tricks that have been used in the past. And then, of course, some of these real advanced CSS, cascading style sheet features that allow you to do transitions and gradients and curved edges on buttons and all kinds of cool features there. The support for those in various browsers is different. For instance, in WebKit, a lot of the CSS styling has been done by using a WebKit-specific CSS tag. So you have to, there are certain considerations there if you are looking to have an experience that's rendered the same across browsers. And then finally, we get into the JavaScript language variations. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So how do you decide what to use and what to do in relation to all of this? Well, what a lot of companies have done basically is they just don't use some of these newer features. They build their websites for, let's say, IE7 or IE8 compatibility, make sure they also look good in all the other browsers, but only use the feature sets that are easily available in those versions of Internet Explorer, and that means all the way back to like versions probably 3 or 4 of Firefox. Another tactic that we'll talk more about is being able to degrade gracefully. So essentially that's having a site that renders different and gets simpler based on what features are available in the browser. Another strategy that we'll speak a little bit more about is line in the sand browser support, basically deciding what you're going to support and just handling those situations there. And then there are some very specific techniques that you can use. The first one here, conditional comments for IE. Let me show this one to you first. Basically, one of the things that you have available in Internet Explorer only is these HTML comments. And so, for instance, right in here, we have this tag that basically is saying if the version of Internet Explorer is less than 8, then basically the HTML that is inside of here will get rendered or interpreted. And these tags are only supported in Internet Explorer versions 5 and greater. IE is the only thing that reads them. So basically, Microsoft knew that IE was different and added support for some of this stuff so that you could deal with its different set of situations. The question comes up, though, how do you deal with the situation where you want something that is not IE? And in that case, we have this tag right here. So this sort of standard intro that you see right here, the bang dash dash, is an HTML comment, and the dash dash over here is the end of a comment. Basically, this is something, again, that only IE will read, and everything else will read everything in between here as standard HTML, but because of the way IE reads this first little bit of data, it will ignore what's in between this tag. So it basically gives you a way of excluding stuff specifically for IE. So this ends up being one of the primary techniques that people use to code for Internet Explorer. One of the other very specific techniques that's used is what's called a CSS reset file. The CSS reset file, here's an example of one. I'm not going to go through it all, but just to kind of show you what they look like. Basically, all the different browsers have different defaults for the margins, the borders, default font size, whether it's at 100% or 95%, and fonts and things like that. They all have their own set of defaults that's used. CSS, of course, allows you to override that in your HTML. And so basically, the idea behind a CSS reset file is to give you a way of setting all the browsers to identical standards to start with. So basically, this is saying for all these different elements, zero out everything. Go for a display block here, whatever the case may be. It basically puts all the same browser, or all the browsers on the same level as each other, so that when you say that you want the margin certain percentage greater than it is by default, well, by default it has no margin. So basically it gives you a good starting point. Then also we have a link here to an article that goes over some of the other techniques that are used. One of the things that was mentioned in that article that a lot of people use is developing for Internet Explorer first, and then they will develop afterwards for they'll basically adjust their website for the other browsers. That technique isn't one actually that I'm a fan of. I think it's probably better to go the other way around. Because Internet Explorer has so many quirks, I think it's probably better to design for the standards in most cases and then make variations where you have to for Internet Explorer. But that's kind of dependent upon your situation. If your primary market is going to be, like, for instance, the medical industry or the insurance industry, well, Internet Explorer pretty much is the only browser they use, and so Internet Explorer may be your development browser of choice. And then lastly here, testing. We'll go over that a little bit later, though. So on to this degrading gracefully. The basic idea here is one that a lot of people are actually taking a different approach to now. Degrading gracefully used to be where you would just have, for instance, JavaScript would disappear from your website and your website would still function properly. It would go into standard form mode rather than an AJAX sort of mode. But a lot of times now there are various ways of avoiding a lot of that degradation. One of them is what's called the HTML5 shiv, and essentially this is a library that adds support for some of the newer elements that are part of HTML5 that allow you to handle some of the rendering issues a little bit better in older versions of IE. And I believe HTML5 shiv adds support for IE version 7 and up, somewhere in that range. Essentially, this is, in fact, you don't even have to use this on your site or download the file to your site. This is something that's hosted on content delivery networks everywhere. Google hosts this for you, so you have easy access to it. Polyfills is a term I just basically wanted to define here because you'll see it used often in relation to browser degradation. So polyfills is basically referring to the ability to add functionality that you would expect the browser to already have natively. So for instance, you'll see polyfills available for certain JavaScript functions that are missing in older versions, again, of Internet Explorer. It's very common to see them referred to that way. So it's just a term that some people are using for that. A third method that people use to get around this degradation is by way of all these frameworks. You know, last time for our Campfire, we talked about the various JavaScript frameworks, and in fact, it's probably one of the best ways that you can avoid having to deal with a lot of these issues, since the frameworks in general provide you with good functions for use in various other browsers. They give you compatibility across multiple browsers, and in fact, they don't consider them necessarily to be cross-browser. Rather, they call them multi-browser frameworks, because a lot of times they will give you functionality and exposed API to use, but it will be slightly different on various browsers, and they acknowledge that fact. But if you use their API, they'll deal with some of the quirks for you. So that's probably one of the most important techniques that you can use, whether it's using something like jQuery or YUI or Dojo or one of those. If you weren't part of our last Campfire, certainly it's probably worth going back to take a look at that. And then basically this last item is essentially the opposite approach of degrading gracefully. Essentially you build as much features as you can into the oldest browser possible, and then you add features forward for newer browsers. It's kind of a glass half full, glass half empty sort of approach to this. If you, in fact, Google around for progressive enhancement browser compatibility, you'll find some very interesting articles on it. So just another area I thought I'd mention. On to line in the sand browser support. So basically, this is related to what you're going to do with Internet Explorer. When you look at actual browser market share out there in totality, so if you're not looking at a very specific version or something like that, you're looking at just Internet Explorer in total, it's still the #1 browser out there. It's used by more people. And in fact, with IE9, it's very possible to create websites without much effort at all that are compatible with Chrome 14 Plus, as I mentioned here, Firefox 12, Safari 5, Opera 12. All of those are a few years old. As it, you know, IE9 is a couple of years old. If that's your target, you can actually cover about 86, and in fact it's a little bit higher because there's all these other little tiny browsers out there that are modern WebKit browsers. It's probably closer to 90% of the market, maybe 89%. But the big one that's left out here is Internet Explorer 8. Right now it has 9% market share in the United States, and really that's the browser to decide upon. IE8 adds a lot of difficulty from the standpoint of development because it wasn't really an HTML5 based web browser, and so there's tons of features missing from it. And if you have to have compatibility for IE8, a lot of those other tricks, you're going to have to implement those yourself. If you're going for IE9 Plus and some of these other browsers, most of the frameworks that are out there will make everything the same for you, and it will just work. So, you know, you kind of need to decide on that. And of course, the other aspect here is market share strategy. When you're deciding upon this, you need to see what your customer base is going to be using. And we're going to skip past a little bit here, and I'm going to show you this browser market share. This is in North America. You'll see that, you know, Chrome overall, for all versions of Chrome, is just shy of 32%. Internet Explorer 9 is somewhere around 17, and on, with IE8 being right there at 9. When we look at it on a global scale, though, the numbers change a little bit. Chrome all of a sudden is at 40%. IE9 is not in second place. Firefox versions 5 Plus are in second place at somewhere around 20%, with IE9 being 14 or 15%. So, you know, what is the market for your website? Is it a localized? Is it industry specific? Is it just for, you know, a specific region? And one of the ways that you can basically decide what browsers you need to support is based on this sort of data. You'll notice the watermark here from Stat Counters. it ends up being a very good resource to tell based on regions as to what browsers are in use. And you'll notice that this data that I'm looking at is very up to date. I'm looking at data from a 30-day period from April to May of 2013. So going back here, the next item we wanted to talk about is basically some of the stuff that I've seen. One of the items that Jessica and I have dealt with has been scroll bars. Scroll bars are one of those things that you may need to style in a browser based on having a scroll bar that matches the look of the website you're building rather than being just the standard button and thumbs that Internet Explorer renders, for instance. And it can be very difficult to style those. And so there are some various techniques you can use there, and I'll kind of show you a little bit that way. And then second is JavaScript features. We came across this a bit in relation to a web application in our case. JavaScript has the ability in newer versions to basically kind of like iterate over an array with a function. It's called the for each function. And that function doesn't even exist in Internet Explorer until version 9. So if you're using an older version of Internet Explorer, you either have to find someone that's made a function for that, which is what we've done, or avoid using that and use a different coding technique entirely. And this is kind of interesting because this for each function is not something new. You'll see here that Firefox has had it since version 1.5. It's been around a long time, and all the other browsers have had it since at least 2005, some of them even earlier than that. Again, like I mentioned, IE is the one out here to worry about, and we'll take a look at a specific website in a little bit that illustrates some of this. The last area I really wanted to mention here is in relation to some various websites that I found very useful. Modernizer is a JavaScript library that will do browser feature detection. So if you're looking at using a progressive enhancement technique, for instance, Modernizer is a very good resource because it'll tell you, which features are available in the current web browser so that you can basically branch off your code, your JavaScript based on that. This next one, way back at one of the early slides there, we were talking about testing. And there are various resources for it. This is the one I've looked at a bit, CrossBrowser testing. Essentially, there's this whole group of services out there that host virtual machines running old operating systems and old browsers. And basically, you can buy services from them to have access to those old browsers on older operating systems also to test your website against. It's very difficult to basically have all the various versions and of Internet Explorer, of Chrome, of Safari, of Firefox, to have all of that on one machine. It's not going to work very well. And so there's been this sort of market that's popped up for doing this. It used to be that you would use a service from Adobe actually called Browser Lab, and just in the last, I think, 2 months in March, that service was shut down, and so we've now got all these new services that are popping up to offer these services to allow you to do that testing. Can I Use is kind of a cool website here, and just to show you that one, this one will let you know based on all the different various features that that the browser supports where you have the ability to use it. Like, for instance, the file reader API is something that is allows you to basically read a file off a file system if the user allows you to, so that you could upload that. But you'll notice that that file reader API is only available as of the current version of Internet Explorer, version 10. Even version 9 doesn't have support for that. And so if you wanted to use that API, you may have to fail back to using something like a Flash plugin even to support that. So very useful website. HTML5, please.com tells you what you should use on your web page. So sometimes you may have features that are available to you, but those aren't necessarily features you should be using just because of the fact that although they're implemented, they may not be implemented well yet. HTML5 Please is a great website for that. And then of course Stat Counter, which I already mentioned, lets you look from a regional standpoint or anything like that. So the one other thing I wanted to mention about browser market share is if you're developing a mobile website. So in a mobile website, basically you're looking at mostly a WebKit-based world out there. But things are different between Android and iPhone and BlackBerry also, and Windows Phone, of course, which is using that that Trident engine still even on Windows Phone, just a slight variation of that. But when you look at the market, the mobile browser market, there's kind of an interesting blip here. In the United States, you'll see that Stat Counter showing somewhere around 46% of the browser market is owned by the iPhone, with 35% or so being Android, and then down from there. In fact, the iPod Touch would actually add on to the iPhone there, and so you'd end up with an even higher percentage, with IE being a very, very small percentage, and Chrome also being a small percentage. If we switch to a worldwide view, you'll see that the numbers are drastically different overall. In fact, Android has, 30, probably 29 or 30% market share, with the iPhone sitting just under 24%, and Opera having a much greater share because Opera Mobile is available on a lot of what are called feature phones, and so worldwide smartphones haven't taken over quite as much as they have in the U.S., so Opera tends to be more popular worldwide. So you'll see that if you are developing for this global market for your website and you have to look at the mobile aspect of it, things are drastically different, based on if it's worldwide or U.S. only. So anyways, those are some of the things that I wanted to talk to you guys about. I'm going to now bring Jessica in, and we're going to ask her some specific questions about her experiences related to this. She does a lot more of this than I do, and so I'm hoping she can really bring some insights to it that may be useful for some of us. So Jessica is with Jessica Chan Studios, her own design firm, and so she's developed a lot of websites for the mobile industry, and also just some, she does some really high quality websites and has definitely had to work with some of these issues. So how are you doing today, Jessica?
I'm great.
Good. Thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
So let me ask you, well, can you tell us a little bit about your overall experience in web application design and in fact these cross-browser issues?
Sure. So I've been designing websites for a little over 9 years and developing for a little over 6. So I've seen a lot of this evolution that you went over for both websites in terms of both front-end and back-end demands as interaction and functionalities become more complex and more in demand, as well as browser development. So I've kind of had to wrestle with a lot of these issues, and the more I learn, overall, the more I learn, the cleaner my code gets. So it's a journey for everyone. And when designing for the web, one of the first things that I realized is the more that you know about how things are implemented when designing, not even talking about coding, the more the designs kind of make sense and the more freedom you have because you understand the constraints and you understand how things are going to look in the browser and how complicated it's going to be to make it look that way. And then in terms of just overall, one of my biggest things was separating design from development. So these cross-browser, techniques and issues, that requires a completely different part of the brain from design is what I discovered. So designing and having that in the back of your head while you're designing is one thing, but making sure that you're not designing while you're coding and while you're fixing these cross-browser issues was something that really was kind of an epiphany for me. And being able to focus on one problem at a time rather than trying to tackle everything at once has really kind of contributed a lot to my growth, I think.
So viewing them as separate disciplines, really,
Exactly.
it sounds like it has proved to be key for you there.
Right. Right.
So when it comes to actually developing these, do you see a lot of demand for people wanting browser compatibility with having compatibility with like IE7 or really early versions of Firefox or anything like that? Is that something you see a lot of?
I have actually, and it's taught me that it's never safe to say anything's dead because one example is I worked with a group within Intel, and they use IE7 up until as late as early this year, and unfortunately I think they still will because all of their employee computers come stocked with it, including the head director, who was our main client. And he insisted on being able to see the Drupal site we were building correctly on his own computer. Never mind the fact that the major portion of his audience are developers with the latest browsers and blah, blah, blah. It was important to him that his own team could see it correctly on their own computers. And so sometimes, just like you said in your presentation, you got to design for your audience. You got to design for your clients. If that's important to him, then that's what he's going to demand, no matter how much you tell him. No one's using this anymore because it's so embedded in I guess their IT infrastructure. He saw that as a requirement. But having said that, I think IE7 is definitely in the long tail, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a client out there that even wants IE6. But I've not seen much of that in terms of volume.
Yeah, from a market share perspective, most of the major stat counter like websites show IE7 at somewhere well below 1%.
Right.
And so it comes down to whether you really need that 99% or that sort of thing. Now, if you have a situation where you're dealing with you've got a customer, for instance, that is willing to go with more modern browser support, for instance, is IE8 still pretty much on the list that you have to have?
It is, and my at one big company I'm working with right now, IE8 is kind of like the official lowest common denominator that we have to develop for. So I do think some bigger companies are still pushing for IE8 compatibility.
Yeah. So when it comes to this stuff, what resources? I showed some of the ones that I've used and found. What do you use to make all of this work? What resources do you rely upon?
Yeah, your presentation covered a lot of it. My go-tos are that CSS reset file, HTML5 shiv, which, like you said, allows IE to read HTML5 tags like header, article, etc. I do personally prefer to use divs more than probably the HTML5 spec recommends, but it's helpful for consistency and flexibility. For if you do need those tags, you want to make sure that IE can read them. jQuery and Dojo, just like you said, helps a lot with compatibility issues. It was really good for me to learn pure JavaScript and know what didn't work with what and why. It provided a really great foundation. And then learning jQuery really took a lot of the memorization and headache out because, it just works kind of thing.
Yeah, jQuery is kind of the go-to, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, it seems to work across. You've got IE8, IE7 based things that are missing that are supported by jQuery without a problem. They somehow deal with all those situations in JavaScript for you, and you basically don't have to think about it, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So
I have a question for Jessica and for you guys too. What is the most common problem you see in cross-browser development? What are the 2 or 3 top things that programmers should keep in mind?
Well, with CrossBrowser, by using the design as a blueprint, what the real goal is just to make sure that it looks good in all browsers. And there are some developers that I think want everything to look exactly the same across browsers, and it's my own personal philosophy that as long as it's kind of as close to the design spec as possible, that's where I like to put my focus. As long as it looks good in the browser and as long as it really speaks to the original design, I think that's fine. But I do think that a lot of people tend to want things to look exactly the same. But realistically, if you're thinking in terms of the user, they're not going to be comparing your site across browsers to make sure things look exactly the same. So that's where I used to that's where I used to get hung up on, because I used to want to be everything exactly the same. Yeah. Yeah.
So in those, so what are the, again, so what are those points, what are those things that are, we should not dwell too much on trying to make him look right across browsers? So what are those things that you found that, okay, I spent too, like Oliver mentioned scroll bars, for example.
Right.
Are there other items like that don't just get so hung up on that you spend too much time, just getting a good look is good enough for that?
I wouldn't say it shouldn't look right. I think it should definitely look right. I think it's something where when the user sees your site, they don't think it's broken. It looks good, but doesn't have to look exactly the same. But in terms of specifics, I've noticed that a lot of people use positioning a lot, like top and left, and not a lot of browsers, or some browsers render those positioning a little bit differently. So you're going to see some pixels off, and sometimes those pixels matter a lot. So, in terms of aligning things like that, it's better to try and have your markup clean enough, if at all possible, so that you don't need to do kind of pixel level adjustments using positioning, position relative. And then another thing that I recently went through is scrolling. So what's really popular right now is using the scroll bar to do parallax effects and things like that, and even to a simpler degree, being able to scroll to a certain position, as a navigational interaction or navigational element, where when you click on something, the page scrolls to a specific place. So scrolling, I think, is kind of the next big thing that people are kind of getting into right now, and just making sure that all the browsers render those scrolling effects the way you want them to.
I noticed on our last project, Jessica, that the one area we really had to deal with scrolling, you left up to me to solve. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Yep.
I got some good experience in that area.
Yeah, I'm sure you could have your own campfire on just that.
Oliver, do you have any examples to show some application? I know that you guys were working on one project, so maybe it would be a good idea to show that.
Yeah. So
across multiple browsers. Yeah.
So this is. Here, let me figure out which one to put it on. I've got one of them here. Okay. So this is an application, obviously, for Jasper Engines and transmissions for their online employment application that we've been building for them. And so, of course, since this is a public-facing website, they wanted broad browser compatibility. And so let me just get into it here. This is developed using Dojo, and yeah, this is a web app-backed site that we've built for them. And so you'll see, let me go just to the next page here. You'll see here that we've gone with a look that kind of fits their corporate their corporate profile overall, and that also has a usability that's meant for the browser market too, so for the mobile market, I mean, so that this could be used on an iPad, for instance. And so one of the things that we had to deal with here was, yeah, getting this very rich-looking website to render correctly across various browsers. And this is really an area that Jessica was able to help us out on. So I'm going to show you the same page So this is in, right now I'm in Safari on Windows. If I go to Chrome on Windows, you'll see that essentially they are basically identical. There is a slight rendering difference in the length of an element, but other than that, they look pretty much the same. Now, when I go over to Internet Explorer, you'll see things are different. In fact, my font is kerned a little different in this case, and you'll see there's very slight spacing issues. And then when I go over to Firefox, I get still a little bit different look. Now, all of these are very subtle differences. Like, for instance, if I switch between Firefox and Internet Explorer and you look up here in the bar, you'll see that the spacing between, like, for instance, the checkbox and the text is different between those. And basically, it's okay in all those cases, but Firefox just chooses to render it with a greater separation between here than all of the other browsers do, in fact. All the other ones are basically the same. In this case, Firefox is the odd man out. But in this case, we used Dojo, and Jessica was able to create a style sheet for us so that our input boxes have a focus rectangle on them, and they have a very specific look that's, if you notice, basically the same across all the browsers. So one of the things that you often have to deal with if you use unstyled input elements, they all are different across the browsers because they're using the browser's native input elements. By styling them, we're able to at least give them the same sort of look. So for instance, our drop-down button across all of these browsers is the same. That's something that you don't get by default. Styling was able to provide that for us. And so I'm just going to do a little bit of entry here so I can get past this. And I need to add something in here because you'll see here in this case we also have some error checking that we've added in that colors the field and tells us if something's wrong. You guys aren't going to see my real social. And just want to get past here so I can show you one other thing. Okay. So you can see here, this one on this, we've been adjusting it a little bit here, but we have just a very small scroll bar here, but this scroll bar is not a standard Safari scroll bar. We've styled this scroll bar along the edge, and in fact, this is a case where probably we could make it a little bit smaller and you wouldn't even see the scroll bar. But you know, this is the sort of thing that you can customize. But on Internet Explorer, you're just going to get a it's going to have a little bit different look to it, and in a lot of cases, it's very difficult to style it there. And so we're just going to fill in some stuff here. And no, yes, yes, no. Okay. And you'll see here, this is the page I was talking about with Jessica. If we were where I had to work on this sort of scrolling thing, you know, we have this sort of bar along the left here that shows where you are, you know, how far down you are. We also have the scroll bar along the other side here. The idea here is that the button wouldn't enable until you're at 100%, but it kind of shows your progress through here. And then in this case, we have these elements that you pick to describe yourself. And so, you know, this is a very customized sort of look that the customers wanted in this case. And, you know, we've been able to get to that by way of employing a lot of these techniques that we talked about. And in this case, Jessica, I think CSS was really what saved us in most cases across these browsers, right?
Right.
So we've been able to use CSS in such a way that we get essentially a unified interface that works across multiple browsers and looks almost the same. And like Jessica said, it doesn't matter all that much if it's slightly different between one browser and the other, as long as the flow is about the same across the browsers. So Jessica, I know you're limited on time. There's one last question I wanted to ask you. Are there any tips or tricks of the trade that you'd like to share in relation to this?
Yeah, well, I mentioned earlier just about the epiphany that I had separating design from development. I would suggest that anybody who's tackling this would definitely, before doing any markup, before doing any code, whether you're using a pencil and paper or Photoshop or Azure or Balsamic, just to make sure that you put in that investment in really structuring your pages. It's something that I personally can't do it just in my head, and when those wireframes or those mock-ups are really thought through, for some reason for me, the clean markup and clean coding follow. And I think that's really key in terms of cross-browser compatibility, because ultimately you can use a lot of hacks, you can use a lot of things where when something doesn't look right, you can asterisk this and, do a lot of different things. But if your markup is really, really, really clean, I would say for 90% of the things you're trying to do, you're not going to have to use any hacks, and you're not going to have to use any pixel perfect adjustments, because you kind of did that due diligence first and really planned out your structure and your elements correctly. So that was kind of that epiphany for me. And along those lines, just clean and semantic markup with comments everywhere just makes you happy, makes you a happier person.
Absolutely.
Especially when you have to go back. And I've also begun to use classes for almost anything as opposed to IDs when it comes to CSS selectors, and reserving IDs for cases that specifically need it, such as JavaScript or Dojo, that kind of takes and uses those IDs to mean very special things, especially object-oriented. And this is something I've only discovered recently, that using classes for semantic markup and for CSS selectors is really something that I'm trying to move to myself. So that's kind of my big
that is a
next
good
thing.
tip. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jessica. I appreciated your input on this, and certainly you can see some of Jessica's work available at her website, and of course she helped us quite a bit on this website here, getting it to look just so. So thank you again for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So I wanted to open this up to anybody else in case you have any questions. Have anything else you wanted to find out about here? Feel free to you can either ask it in the questions area, or if you raise your hand, we can unmute you. Okay. So we got a question from Chuck here. Are you referring to? He asks about the numbers that we're actually using here. Are you talking about the baseline of the numbers in here being off slightly? Is that what you're referring to? He asked about the numbers being off. And Chuck, it looks like we unmuted your audio. So.
Oh, you did? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, the numbers look a little weird on there.
So
12 and the Social Security number is so much smaller, and look at the alignment on the zip code is ascending. The baseline is ascending.
In fact, this is literally related to the font that we're using in this case. We've been playing with the fonts on it, and so this font kind of just does some of that stuff. So probably needs to change to a little bit different font, but we've been playing with that a bit. The text renders, if you notice, it looks fine, but you end up with this stylized W and some stuff like that. So we've just been playing with fonts on that, and so right now you're seeing it with one of those fonts.
Oh, okay, that makes sense now.
So.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, nothing real specific in that case. and you'll notice a CrossBrowsers. We're able to pull in the same sort of fonts, and you'll notice on all of them the twos. It's not just in the middle. The twos are small overall on this font, and the nines have a very low set to them. So yeah, just happens to be that the font that was used in this case.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. And any other questions or things anybody wanted to see specifically? On this website,
Richard. Rich. Oliver, one second. Rich had a question. Rich, you there?
Oh,
yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're on now.
Yes.
Okay. We've been using Microsoft's LightSwitch application development platform for some time, up to this point primarily for desktop, which is the Silverlight rendered stuff.
Yes.
But we're going to start developing some mobile applications that we would want to work in a tablet or potentially even a smartphone environment. And so LightSwitch uses, and again, I'm not totally up on this, but it uses kind of a dynamic rendering kind of a process. And so if you have that kind of a process where you're, when we built our earlier web applications using, the DataFlex tools, we pretty much did all of the client-side design work, and then of course we use the DataFlex stuff for the back end. Whereas in this case, it's rendering your client kind of dynamically. What does that pose? What challenges does that potentially pose for us as far as cross-browser compatibility and control, the level of control we might have in that?
So the issues that you come across when you use that, basically you've got a very similar situation to some of the stuff that the data access is doing with 17.1. In fact, it's a very similar situation to that. And essentially, what you're doing in those cases is you're buying into the framework that vendor is including with with their product. So, for instance, Data Access has rolled their own framework. Microsoft with LightSwitch has done a similar thing, and so if sometimes you have access to that framework to be able to fix specific bugs in it, but a lot of times those frameworks can be a bit complicated to get into on your own, and so you just basically have to deal with the vendor on those sorts of issues to get them worked out. But that's what they're doing. They're just basically using their own framework. Some of them use third-party stuff. Like it's possible that Microsoft is actually tying into something like jQuery and using that in addition to their own framework. I know some of the vendors out there are doing that sort of thing.
Right. I mean, I know, for instance, you can use, for instance, like Component 1's Widgmo, which is a jQuery-based set of components, client-level components. And so I guess if you did that, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, because I haven't dived into it, is understanding at what point you insert yourself into dealing with the cross-browser compatibility issues. Do you even have access to, because it's dynamically rendered, do you even have access to an intermediate place at which you can insert yourself and fix issues? Or, like you said, are you kind of restricted to what?
Well, it really depends. I don't know specifically about LightSwitch, but like for instance, Data Access with their stuff has given you a couple of spots that you can tie in there, but the difficulty in doing that is that in general, you're essentially on your own with some of that stuff. So, you have to learn their framework and figure out how they're, doing their dynamic piece of it. If they don't, a lot of times that stuff ends up being the pieces that don't get documented that well. And so you can insert into it, but essentially the techniques you're going to use to do all of that are proprietary to that product specifically. So it's, with Microsoft's LightSwitch, for instance, there's probably going to be a decent-sized community out there that's doing some of that you can turn to for some of those issues. But it's not going to be like, for instance, dealing with a more generic solution where you have the resources of, the jQuery community or something like that to tie into, because they're going to be using their own techniques as to how they're doing their dynamic injection and things like that.
Okay.
So you just have to understand that that's what you're choosing to do from that standpoint. Is you're buying into the fact that if you're using that piece of it and dealing with the cross-browser piece of it in that way, then you have to use their means to get to those. In most cases, they give you a way to, but you have to learn their techniques.
Oliver, I have a question here from Chuck. It says, for mobile version, are you going to use PhoneGap or Sencha?
Chuck, are you referring specifically to this application here, or just in general?
It was that application. Is that the direction you're going to go with? I assume you're going to have a mobile version of this at some point.
Right now, from the standpoint of what Jasper wants with it, they just want it available on the web and to work on mobile. So this pulls up really nice on an iPad right now, and does a full screen iPad application for it, and works out just fine. If they wanted to do a mobile version of it, we would in fact keep it in the same thing it's in. It could be embedded in PhoneGap if they wanted to go that way. But no reason to do Sencha Touch in this case. Dojo has good mobile widget support, and and this is a Dojo-based application, so we're in good shape from that standpoint.
Okay. A follow-on to that is maybe you or Jessica. What about using Dreamweaver 3 or the new stuff that's out there in the cloud now to take care of this browser incompatibilities? It's been one of the features they've been touting for a while at Adobe, that you just have to design it one time and then Adobe will write all the CSS to take care of the different browsers and platforms that's running on.
I don't think Jessica is with us anymore. She had to leave a little early, but I have talked to her about that issue specifically early on in this project, and I can tell you what she told me. And what she told me is that in general, she prefers and finds it faster to sit down with an editor and do the development just in a standard text editor with good HTML support, rather than working in a product like Dreamweaver, because the templated code that Dreamweaver ends up putting out, it can work for some websites, but for a very dynamic website, she said it doesn't spit out stuff that's essentially useful for her for a dynamic website. So I think if you are looking at more of a static, maybe an advertising style website, that would be a good option. I know for a very dynamic application like this is, that she felt it certainly wasn't the right way to go.
Okay. I know Ross Retzheimer. I don't know if he's attending the Campfire today or not, but he mentioned he might. But he had used Dreamweaver 3 and did a nice little presentation at Disney last time on how to use Dreamweaver 3 to style a Ajax application, the old Ajax library. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, Oliver, I think we're at the end of our time, so.
Yeah, I think we are. I wanted to thank all of you for joining us here and participating in the Campfire today, and stay tuned for our next topic.
Thank you.